Would you share with us something of your own personal journey around servant leadership?
My own personal journey around servant leadership, I think, became the most significant around the age of 17 when I first met who would be the woman that would be my future wife. And I was first challenged towards something like how to be purposeful or more purposeful with your life versus just bouncing around and hitting off of things and not really being purposeful. And I wasn't necessarily going off the deep end. I just didn't have purpose, and I think that is pretty typical for a lot of Americans, especially young Americans. And that had to do with the society I was raised in and my own personal way of looking at the world that I was unconscious of. So if we look at our society and young Americans right now, there's a lot of media and a lot of fast, what we might call fast thought. If we look at purposeful lives lived throughout the centuries, the thought slows down. And the willingness to slow down and be deeply embedded in deeper and deeper thoughts becomes readily apparent. So when I met my wife, she was a pretty amazing person, full of fire and verve and vitality, and she was already into that deep level of thinking, which can equate to a deep level of living. And I remember when she first challenged me, let's go back and read the 10 major books that have influenced each other's lives. Now, right now, if we just did that with a cross-section of American young people, I'm willing to bet that 17 and 18-year-olds, it would be very few percentage-wise that would be able to come up with 10 books that influenced their lives. I could come up with 7, and they were all children's books. And so I was hurting in the reading category. And my wife had 10, and they were amazing. So when we read each other's books, interesting enough, she had read all 7 of mine before I made the list. She read a lot of books, right? That was great. I had read none of her 10, before I saw the list. So then we go about reading them. And these were books like Candide and A Tale of Two Cities and The Four Loves by C.S. Lewis and the whole Lord of the Rings series. They were books that are going to change your way of looking at the world. And they did. And I remember after reading those 10, I never went back and just kept reading. The next big movement after that was we were living in Germany, Jennifer and I, and Black History Month came up, and we were in a town that had an army base. It was in Gießen in Germany. I had a lot of friends on the army base, and I went into the bookstore, which, just a place for people to buy books there on the base, and there were about 3 full rows devoted to Black History Month. And right there, I started noticing, wow, there might be an entire row that's just Martin Luther King Jr. And I've never read anything on Martin Luther King Jr. As a matter of fact, I was enculturated with, now looking back, quite a bit of what Bell Hooks would call white supremacist patriarchy. Because the only thing I knew about Martin Luther King that was in my mindset was things about him that would frame him in a dark light. His possible life with other women outside of his marriage. His possible cheating on his dissertation. Those two, and those may or may not have happened, but I think it's a fascinating indictment that's placed on somebody without ever reading anything by him. Especially when you consider that the person who accused Martin Luther King the most was quite an interesting person named Hoover. And his own personal life and his own struggles become fascinating when we start thinking about accusations and the ways people approach the world. Anyway, I brought down off the shelf Strength to Love, a collection of Martin Luther King Jr.'s 10 sermons. Changed my entire way of looking at the world and servant leadership. And I still have Martin Luther King interwoven with people like Paulo Freire and Bell Hooks and Robert Greenleaf because of that original movement. And then later when servant leadership came into it, they just dovetail very well.
Several places, Greenleaf talked about the Latin root of religion, religio, meaning to rebind. I've met sincere servant leaders of all faiths, philosophies, and secular beliefs over the years. What are your thoughts, in particular, around servant leadership, faith, and philosophy?
I love Greenleaf's look at servant leadership, faith, and philosophy. and his take of religion and its original etymology, meaning to rebind. My own work and research is in forgiveness and in what's the nature of ultimate violence and how is it healed by ultimate forgiveness. And as we look at that around the nations, I think there's profound movements of servant leadership coming out of many nations after having suffered major atrocities. South Africa and Rwanda and Croatia and Serbia, and here in the U.S. with regard to the atrocities that have been committed against Native Americans, there are profound movements of rebinding. So the Big Hole Massacre in northern Montana, people gather and the grandchildren, the children, the descendants of cavalry troops who committed the massacre and the children of Nez Perce people who were massacred gather to have a reconciliation or a rebinding ceremony that is built, that is directed and peacefully engaged by the Nez Perce. And that's servant leadership in a very, very profound way. So when I think of faith and I think of Greenleaf's idea of to rebind, I get very excited about it because I know that that type of thing can become something that's a deep healer in society. It just takes a lot of courage and a lot of willingness on the part of many people coming together to begin that type of work.